For those that are just coming in, for anyone who's not aware, this talk was organized by Cape Cod DSA. My name is Cole Silva, and that is Michael Harris.
Oh, sorry. Got distracted.
We are both co-chairs of Cape Cod Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest socialist organization in the country. Our mission is to educate ourselves and those around us on the inherently destructive nature of capitalism and look to socialism as an alternative while pushing for transformational changes from the local level all the way up to the federal level. Some popular democratic socialists you may be familiar with are Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Albert Einstein, and Martin Luther King Jr. And while the organization as a whole focuses on many different issues, each chapter can choose, based on their membership, what they would like to work on. So for Cape Cod DSA, we're currently focusing on 3 different areas. We're collaborating with other DSA chapters across the state on a ballot initiative to achieve Medicare for all in the state of Massachusetts, as well as pushing for a green stimulus in Massachusetts, which is similar to the Green New Deal. And at the Cape level, where we are in Cape Cod, we're currently investigating how we can alleviate the housing situation, particularly the lack of year-round rentals and the sky-high prices of the few rentals that do exist. And at the moment, we're looking into the possibility of constructing social housing on Cape and what that would entail. So it is 6 past the hour. I think we are going to get started. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what tonight is going to look like, and then I have a short introduction of Luis, who is here with us, and then we'll move right into that. So similar to last week, we're going to have an adjusted format where Luis will speak for roughly 20-ish minutes, give or take, and then enter into a dialogue with Michael and possibly me, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience for all of you watching at home. While Luis is speaking, the chat will be disabled to avoid distractions, so please write down any questions you do have throughout the talk and put them in the chat once it opens back up when that kind of dialogue section is finished. Additionally, any hateful or inappropriate behavior will result in an immediate ban from the event with no opportunity for re-entry. So please keep it civil. So for our speaker this week, we have Luis Fernandez, who is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. His teaching and research focus on social control, social movements, and globalization in late modernity, and he is active in various community-based efforts related to immigration and policing. He is the author and editor of several books, including Policing Dissent, Social Control and the Anti-Globalization Movement, Contemporary Anarchist Studies, and Shutting Down the Streets. His work also appears in various book chapters and journals, including Social Justice, Contemporary Political Theory, Critical Criminology, and Qualitative Sociology. His most recent research focuses on the alt-right and the emergence of neo-fascism. Fascism. Okay. Fernandez served as the president of the Society for the Study of Social Problems in 2017 and 2018, and he is currently the chair for the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Please welcome Luis Fernandez. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. All right, you want me to take over?
Yes.
All right, well, thanks. Big hello from Arizona. Just a quick little background on myself. I am originally from Nicaragua. I'm an immigrant, came to the US when I was 10, kind of clawed my way and worked myself into academia somehow. And that's another long story and chat that we'll have at another time. I have worked specifically on issues relating in protest and policing, the relationship between protest and policing. And I am absolutely fascinated by the relationship between control and resistance. That interaction to me is like the one thing that I can't stop reading and thinking about over the last 15, 20 years. I've done lots of work on immigration issues, both as a scholar and as an activist, engaging in Arizona over the last 15 years. What I want to do today is actually talk to you about some things that very specifically talk to you about policing and really kind of engage in the notion of police abolition, and we'll get to that. But I want to kind of put it into context. And I want to start by first saying that we just experienced, and we are in the middle of the beginning of a very intense economic crisis that is underway because of the shutting down of global economy. and that this is going to create a lot more issues in the coming years, and we're just barely starting that particular moment. And that even in that moment, this is just so new since March, but even in a few months, we've already seen one of the largest and most intense uprisings in a generation or more. Something that, that I have never seen, something that I've been studying in a variety of different ways, but I was just completely taken aback to how quickly it developed, the issues that they engaged in, and the speed and the nature of it just being flat across the United States and internationally in that. And because of that, unexpectedly, or maybe expectedly, because of the economic crisis and this revolt, the police became a focal point. Right, police became this notion. This people began to pay close attention, and I experienced that in relation to people asking me to speak like this, and say things. And I want to say that the things that I'm going to talk about, I've been saying for a while, and they've been written for a while. And I was kind of in the margins. It seemed like I was speaking a specialized language, and now it seems almost commonsensical. Right, that people are like, oh, I get that, I engage with that. And that's a huge change in very, very short period of time that has occurred. So to look at that and look at this context, we need to figure out, in a certain sense, we need to start with what's the police, right? If we're engaging, before we get to abolition, before we get to that, what is the police? Where does it come from, right? I want to talk to you about the origins of policing. Then I want to define the function, define for you how I think of policing, what I think is the most useful, describe the problem a little bit briefly. Then I want to define some solutions that people have so that we understand certain kinds of languages, what the language of reform it is, what the language of defund is, and what the language of abolition is, and why they sometimes feel like it's talking like this, because they're assuming different things about the function of police. And then maybe end with some alternatives to policing that are being proposed right now and are being talked about, and I think are going to become much bigger in the coming year in relation to demands for change. So that's kind of my I'm going to do the origin, the function, the problem, define some concepts, and then finish with alternative. So here we go. So policing, right? In the United States, the police developed in two areas historically. You can think of three, but I'm going to talk about two specifically. And one of them is in the South and in the North. And we're talking really early on, the police develop in relation to the policing of the plantation. So if you think of police as that system that engages in maintaining the social order really relatively early in the South developed around the production, the plantain production, and the relations that occur under a plantain production, right? The plantation really early on in the United States developed around slavery, so therefore it requires certain kinds of structures. That means it requires lots of people to engage under slavery in order to produce these kinds of products that are going to be economically profitable, right? And the system of slavery, of course, develops. And in this system, lots of people are required to exist under subjugation, right? It happens that in this system, the dividing line becomes the racial line, and the line, develops in a particular kind of way. If you read Rutgers in terms of black and whiteness, the blackness becomes the slave relation, and the whiteness becomes the wage relation, and then you need to maintain these particular kinds of relations. So early on, really before some of this even is fully crystallized, you begin to see the requirement of a system that has to create some stability, because when you bring lots of people under subjugation, the first thing that people under subjugation do is they want to rebel, because it's not particularly fun for any human being to be enslaved, and they're in large numbers, they will rebel. So the very first things that develop really, really early on is the slave patrols, right? They're vigilante groups that begin to be mostly local groups that begin to police very specific things, particularly movement between plantations, right? And around the same time, you begin to see the law begin to change, and you begin to see the slave codes developed by 1705. And the slave codes, of course, instantly say no education, no weapons, no travel for slaves. And that is because they have to pacify this particular population. So you see the law and the beginnings, the proto-police, we could call them, begin to develop in conjunction in relation to maintaining the particular system, right? That system, of course, begins to develop, and by 1870, you begin to see this vigilante slave patrols really become a formalized police. And by that point in Charleston, South Carolina, you have the larger slave patrol of 100 officers that are now by that point being paid. And they're incorporated into local cities and local counties in relation to that. So they develop in relation to the ability to try to police the movement of slaves and the education of slaves so that they don't revolt, right? So here we see these particular individuals making sure that a slave doesn't move from one location to the other, so that there is no communication and coordinated effort in order to create a large revolt. In the North, you see the police develop a little bit differently. So the police develop around the control of urbanization, right? So if you're in the South, you see the control of plantation, that in the North, you see urbanization. You see people begin to get moved from the rural areas into the cities. You begin to see more bigger cities, and you begin to see the development of the watchman, right? And the watchman begins at the earliest in 1650 in New Amsterdam, with 8 watchmen being hired to look over the streets, and they're just kind of making sure that at night things are relatively okay. But this develops, begins to develop, and after this system, you begin to get paid watchmen, and you begin to develop these individuals that begin to watch the movement of the streets. But you begin to see something else too, and you begin to see the connection or the movement by the 1830s. Begin to see the 40s, the development of factories. And the development of factory means the development of the proletariat, a kind of a proletariat. And therefore, you begin to see a police force that develops in relation to not the control of the plantation like in the South, but in control of the proletariat in relation to the North. So you begin to see the police, and you begin to see the laws develop in that in relation to assembly, movement, riots. You begin to see all these kinds of laws that develop, again, in conjunction with police in relation to the control of the social order that is occurring there. In the North, this is a slightly different kind of social order than the South, right? So you begin to see these two. I don't have time to talk about this, but in the Southwest, there's a different set of practices that develop more around the sheriff and more around the patrolling of indigenous populations. But I don't have time to go on that, so I'll skip it. But at some other point, we can talk about it if needed. But there's actually 3, but I'm just going to talk about these 2 for now. So if we look at that, if we think about that, and we see the emergence of police in these 2 particular realms, the question becomes, well, what is the police then? How does it function? What is this thing that develops? We tend to think that the police is something that protects the peace, right? That's the modern language that we use, that it's, some people use peace officers and engage in this particular kind of language. For me, I see, when I look at the role that police play in this complicated way, I tend to think of the police and I like to look at them as an institution, right? As an institution embedded in historical and specific class and racial and gender-based relations that then engage in those particular kinds of relations and sometimes reinforce them and reproduce them. So for me, if you ask me what the function of police is, my short answer is it's about maintaining the social order. Right? So I move away from the notion that police are good people or they're bad people, or we have good apples or bad apples, or this police officer. I have no doubt that some officers are absolutely wonderful human beings, and that some officers are not. And that's not particularly interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the function that the institution plays. So if the institution plays the function of maintaining the social order, right, that is the role that it maintains, then the question is, so if it maintains the social order, what does that mean? That means that the function is to maintain, connect, and interact with the rules and regulations of any specific moment, right? So that the rules, laws, and regulations of any specific moment, the police are going to engage in making sure that those continue and are implemented. Now, this is absolutely outside of morality, which I like, meaning that I'm not arguing that that's good or that that's bad or that we should do. You know what? It is what it is. That is that there are going to be particular social orders. They're going to be reflected through legal systems, and the police tend to implement and reproduce those particular social orders regardless of its morality. So, for example, if you look at the function of police under segregation, you will notice, I mean, it's not too far in the distant past, that under segregation, you have laws that force individuals to move in separate directions, right? The people over here, these people over here. And when protesters began to question that, the first thing that you see is the police arresting or engaging in those particular individuals to make sure that the social order that is implemented is stayed in place, because the social order is a segregated social order. So the police engage in that particular thing because that is what is required in order to maintain that particular social order and that system of segregation. Same thing under any particular system, right? That is the role the police engage in order to, that's the role that they do, right? So they engage in that. So the police then are the frontline maintenance of order, regardless of its function. And the question you might ask is, well, what role does it maintain now? Or what social order does it maintain now? And we're not under segregation order. We're not under slave codes. We're not under Jim Crow. We have a particular kind of very specific order that engages a high inequality in relation to the distribution of wealth across the United States, that requires certain individuals to be able to consume and accumulate wealth in very specific kinds of ways, and other individuals need to get out of the way for that particular consumption. So the police then tend to have to try to regulate that order. So for example, if you look at the way that the economy is run in relation to consumption, you need to create a social order that allows human beings to consume in particular kinds of ways in order for money to move in particular kinds of circles, right? And accumulate in particular kinds of companies. So anything that gets in the way of that accumulation then becomes something that becomes a problem to that particular social order. Look at the example of homeless, right? There's been lots of laws in relation to homeless sitting on the sidewalk or sleeping in places or engaging in situations that it gets in the way of people being able to shop, right? Or look at the way the privatization of shopping, where you go into malls that is actually a private area where citizens don't have the right to protest and do those things because it's a private space. So therefore you've controlled that particular space for the consumption and the accumulation so that people can consume. And if you go in there and engage in other kind of behavior, you don't have the right to do that and you're exited out, right? So there are these kinds of orders. And of course, not to speak of the racial order and the gender order that are also reinforced in a variety of different ways. So given that, what's the problem, right? What problem do we have now? That's my background and the history that I wanted to give. I think that the current problem, I don't have to spend very much time because we're in a different historical moment than we were if I had talked to you 5 months ago. And that is that I would have to probably define, give you some data, show you the thing, but I think I don't have to convince you because I'm going to assume that you know the problem, right? And that is that we are in a racial a racial and class disparity of differentiation that can be seen in a variety of different ways, including income, labor, homelessness, just a variety of different locations. And the problem is that it became particularly visible in relation to the killing of young Latino, Black, Indigenous individuals, right? Mostly male, because that's usually who gets killed. And it became particularly visible, and certain movements and certain groupings began to point at that as the location, not because that's the only problem, but that's the location where the problem becomes the most visible, right? And again, I'm not going to give you the numbers. You can go look them up. They're there. They're really well documented in terms of the differentiation of killing and the risk of being shot if you're of a particular kind of background. So if that's the problem, right, we have a disparity in relation to the killings that actually point to a variety of other issues in our society. The question then becomes, well, how do we deal with that? What do we do with that? Well, how do we know that this has been an issue for a long time. It's not new, right? And it's been going on for quite a while. It's been happening. So how do we engage with that? Well, I'm going to describe to you three different possible approaches that are common, right? The first one, we have these issues, we have the killings of young people, and you say, well, okay, we need to reform the police, right? That's the most common. In fact, that is the kind of call that we've been hearing for the last 30, 40 years, right? I think the police as an institution is one of the most reformed institutions of any. They just go through reform every 3 or 4 years for a variety. This is going way further back. This is not to dismiss that there haven't been changes that are really important, because there have been, but just to say this is one of the most reformed institutions in the nation. So you say, okay, so we have a problem. What do we do? Well, the problem is that we have some bad apples, right? We have bad policies, we have bad training, because the problem is a practice problem, not, that's what it is, it's a practice problem. The institution itself is quite functional, is particularly good, but there's some bad aspects to it. There's some groupings of individuals, and we need to then, to solve it, if that's the case, then to solve it, we need some adjustments, minor or major adjustments, right? We need more training. That means that an individual needs to be trained in relation to when to use force. And maybe make that more restrictive so that you can actually use force in only more specific locations. We need more training in relation to de-escalation. So train the police officers to de-escalate when they get to a particular location, right? We need to diversify the police. And the problem is that maybe there's not enough diversification. So if we have people of color, Latino, Black people, Indigenous people, so let's hire more of those folks from the community, or hire them in relation to the leadership, right? Or develop community policing. Let's develop new aspects, new forms of policing that engage a different kind of aspect of police. And these reforms, which I'm just mentioning a few, there's more, these reforms then, the idea is we can change and tweak and hone in, and the problems will be solved. This is, I think, something that Obama was very big into, and of course Biden is really speaking about this, hinting at it. He said, he needs to be a reform, and he's going to argue for $300 million more for his policing for the reform, so we can reform this issue. So the assumption here, again, is to say police have these locations, the institution is no problem, not no problem, but it needs to be fixing, and the fixing can be done through a series of changes in relation to hiring, implementation, policy, engagement with community, all those kinds of things. Well, if you fall into that, those kinds of answers are going to make sense to you, right? And you're going to hear the logic of bad apples and, more training and those kinds of things. Well, so that's that argument. We'll put it aside, and you'll hear it, I think, quite strongly coming up. Defunding is a little different. Defunding as a concept kind of originates, it's been around for a little while, but I really saw it kind of take off after what I've been calling the first BLM, movement, the first BLM mobilization. And I was looking at looking at this and engaging, trying to study the organizations that came out of it in the nonprofit agencies and what kind of claims they were making. And I wrote an article about this because I thought there was an innovation. And that is that they began to pick up the notion of police abolition, which I'll talk about in a second. But within that, there was this concept of police defunding. As you know, they also talked about defunding, disarming, and disbanding. But defunding really is what really took off, and people are really holding on to this one right now, right? So it originates with the first one. People have written about it and engaged in it. But by the second wave, in the last few months, it really took off. Right? People and I know that a lot of people were like, where is this coming from? Who said that? Where? As if it came from nowhere, but it didn't. It was always underneath in relation to people claiming this. And this particular position comes out of, it's a little critical of the idea of reform, right? So that means that it starts with totally different assumptions about what the police and what the problem is. So one of the assumptions is that you can't reform the problem. Right? And that is that we have been trying reform for a long time, and that reformation, those reforms, have not really led to the kinds of outcomes that we should expect by now. So one of the best examples and descriptions, I know that Alex Vitale wrote about this, and I think it's really good. There's an article that he wrote, an op-ed piece at The Guardian, and he's also written a book called End of Policing. I highly recommend you should read. But he argues, he shows that, he says, look, if you look at Minneapolis, right? Minneapolis is engaged in the first BLM mobilization because a young man gets killed there. There is, on the streets, there is some serious confrontation that occurs in the streets there. Obama comes in, and not Obama, but the Obama administration, the Department of Justice, comes in, and the Department of Justice engages in one of the most intense reform policies that you can imagine. And that is that the police of Minneapolis implements training on implicit bias, on mindfulness, on de-escalation, and crisis intervention. So every officer is required to engage in these things. It diversifies the department leadership. So they bring in Black and Latino folks and bring in and diversify that particular. They create tighter use of force standards, like I was telling you. It's like, nope, you can only use them in these particular locations in this particular way. They adopt body cameras for the police officers. They initiate a series of police community dialogues to engage the community, to speak and engage, because to get a better relationship with the community. And they identify also an early warning system of problem police officers, right? So they're really engaging in trying to really reform this particular issue. And 5 years later, it's one of the places where things go off the worst, right? So this is one of the arguments from this position is the reforms don't really get at this. They don't really solve this particular issue. If it would, this would be one of the locations where we would have one of the least intense interactions between police and community, right? Because of all the work that was done for 5 years in relation to this. So from the defund police, defund really becomes a strategy that says, what we do is not necessarily reform the police. So think of the police as a pie like this. So the idea is not to just grow the pie in a different direction, right? So that it's like, here's the policing, but now here's the same policing with community policing or with this other training, and the actual funding for the police actually gets increased, and actually policing actually grows in a particular way. The funding says what we need to do is we need to actually shrink the ability of police to engage in specific areas of the community where they shouldn't really be engaged in. The term that I've heard from this perspective is you divest in order to reinvest. So here's the pie of the police. You take a slice of that and you move it to another part of the city budget or the county budget or the state budget. So and that requires a reduction in the police, in the function of police. That means the police begin to not respond to certain kinds of things very specifically. So they take some power away from them. It also, this is the contentious part, I think, because police budgets, for the most part, often they're kind of like universities, where the budgets are mostly salary budgets. So that means that a reduction in university is often a reduction of faculty, a reduction in policing is often a reduction in police, right? And there's a question about safety and police that's very complicated, but we'll leave that for another side. I'm just giving you what these folks are arguing and engaging in, right? So the idea is to redistribute the economic pie within a city, within a county, within a state, and say, you, and the pie, there's some pages where you can find web pages and work that just developed over the last few months that can give you what city, major cities, what the pie is. So for the city of Phoenix, I think it's somewhere around 41% of the city income that's coming in from, you know, whatever it is that there's coming in, 41% goes to law enforcement and policing, right? For different cities is larger or smaller. So one of the questions to often ask is, what is the budget and percentage that a city is spending under law enforcement, and how does that compare to other services? Because the idea is to grab some of that money and move into other services, right? For example, mental health services, homeless shelters, things that engage. In fact, we can even go to health. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So what do we need right now? We need epidemiologists. We need people that are people that understand how things get spread, how disease gets spread, and help us maintain that so we can reduce that particular kind of spread. And those kinds of groupings in cities and counties have been reduced really over the last 40 years. And the police have grown over that time. So this is an attempt to say, hey, maybe it's time to start reversing that particular trend. So that's what I hear from that particular kind of defunding kind of middle ground. I'm kind of framing it as a middle ground kind of position, right? And by the way, I'm not claiming any of these. I'm just telling you what I see and trying to explain to you what I see. The last one is police abolition. So this perspective is a little stronger, a little edgier intentionally. And that is that, you know, not that these are exclusive, but I wanted to separate them conceptually. Police abolition starts with a very, very strong assumption that the role of police is the maintenance of the order of capital, right? That is. So the main order is a capital order. And by that, I don't want to reduce everything to class. I'm not making that argument. I'm making that the order of capital is a complicated order that requires race, gender, sexuality, a whole bunch of different particular things in particular arrangements in relation to the capital accumulation, and that the role of police is to then try to reproduce those particular kinds of orders, right? So, to abolish the police, to ask for the abolishment of the police from an abolitionist perspective, is to abolish the system that maintains the social order, right? That's what this system, this set of arguments are a little stronger. So they're saying, what we need to eliminate is not the police, but the police, because the police are the location where we can make an entry into the maintenance of a very specific kind of social order. Again, don't confuse this with me arguing for this or agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just telling you how this argument functions. And the police abolitionists might argue, you tend to think of the criminal justice system as a system itself that contains, right? So we have the police, the courts, the correctional and prison system. And there's been lots of work over the last 30 more years in relation to abolishing the prison system, because the prison system is a really destructive and it's connected to a leftover continuation of slavery practice and all these kinds of arguments that argue with that. What we're seeing now that I think is a little bit interesting and innovative is a notion that the police are maybe a more strategic place to function, to focus on, because the police might be a conveyor belt that go from the community, the entry into the community, the entry into correctional systems, into courts, and then the entry into the prison system. So if you think of it as a conveyor belt, it's like instead of going to the very end and then release or post-release, actually start at the very beginning, because if you disrupt the very beginning, you might disrupt the conveyor belt that ends up people in prison. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I think that that's the logic of that particular kinds of that particular kind of argument, right? So when movements are asking for the abolition, they are saying we want the radical inequality to end, right? So they're not just saying we want the police to disappear. They're saying we want particular kinds of systems to disappear. We want the ability to have a system where, you know, the police are represented in that system, but a police where my body is not destroyed because somebody thinks that my body is worth less than a particular piece of property or a car or some object, right? That a human being is valued at a much higher level than an object, that they're not equal. And that is you know, that, and therefore I think, if I read it right, that the argument to abolish the police is an argument to change the system entirely in relation to justice. So, with that, the last piece, there are these ideas that I'm talking to you have been around for a little while. They're not mine and they're not new. They're movement ideas and they're people that are struggling these ideas. And all I do is identify them and kind of conceptualize them, but they're already well formed. These ideas, like I said, were ideas that seemed almost ridiculous for a while. And now they seem almost commonsensical because people were in the streets with such intensity. So just a throwaway idea here is, if anybody ever once ask, what's the point of protesting and what's the point? I often say, well, look how quickly we changed from me being a marginal idea that seemed kind of insane for people to talk to me, from different locations like PBS, and me speaking like this and people going, oh, that actually kind of makes sense. I didn't do that. That was done from the pressure from the streets, right? Because they built that particular thing. Given that I think there's going to be a series of struggles, because I think people cannot be in the streets for that long without being exhausted and without just running the physical, body to the ground. So we saw an up and a down. Now, will there be another one? I don't know, possibly, possibly not. But we saw that and it changed the common sense of how we think. And there's a moment to be talking to people about what's happening, and lots of people are doing that, and lots of groups are already engaging in these particular kinds of struggles. And they're turning their eye to the city, to the county, to the state in relation to the budgets of police, right? And they're already coming with alternatives to what to do. So when you ask them, okay, so if we grab money from the police and what are we going to do with that money? And they're like, okay, no problem. Here's some ideas. Eliminate all transit police. Transit police, like tickets, ticketing, engaging. Those are staff that are going out giving tickets. Those are not violent crimes. Those are not particularly huge issues in that. So one of the things is just grab all that money that has to do with transit, take it out, boom, out. We still have to, we might need some, but take it out and grab all that money and put it towards other things. One argument that I'm hearing is getting crime labs out of police departments. Crime labs should be scientifically based information that lead to prosecutions and all that should be unrelated to law enforcement. Because the relationship between scientists and crime ends up being, kind of questionable in terms of conflict of interest. So grab all those labs and go, nope, done with those labs. They're moving out. They're going to become, I don't know, it's not civilian because police are civilian, but they're going to become non-law enforcement based. People are talking about civil patrols for property offenses. Right, so if there's a property offense, again, what I was saying, move away from the idea that property is more valuable than human beings, to actually have, if you have a bike stolen or a car or some issue like that, to actually have civilian organizations that are perhaps within cities that don't have the same powers of the police officers to come out, do the filing of papers and doing all that in a relation that does not lead to direct criminalization of some of that behavior. Not that it's allowed, but no longer have the police engage in that. So you grab that money, put it into a different set of groupings. One is drop-off centers. One of the things that police do is that they engage often with mentally ill individuals that end up they're not thinking correctly, they're acting really weirdly, and through police training, that is justification for shooting, because they might be threatening to the police officer. So what you do is that in particular kinds of situations that they can be identified, you have individuals, you have trained community individuals in psychology respond to particular kinds of calls or particular kinds of areas. Or another one is what they're calling integrated drop-off centers. So you develop centers that have the needed help for particular kinds of individuals, and when somebody's having a psychotic break or a particular kind of mental problem, you take them there and you can literally drop them off, and they can do a psychological analysis and you can engage. And again, there's not a lot of money for this, so you have to take some of the funding in order to fund some of these particular issues. Yeah, so those are just some. There's quite a few more that are being developed and implemented, and my guess is that there's going to be a lot more coming in the coming year. So that's kind of my talk. I don't know how long I talked, but that's kind of my talk in relation to police abolition, and I'll turn it to you and you can ask questions.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm gonna start by saying, everyone, you can start sending us your questions. Cole is gonna kind of go through them, and we'll pick out the best ones, I guess. I don't like to hierarchy it, but we'll you can start doing that. So you said a lot, and a lot of it's fascinating. I'd love to, if we had more time, to go back and talk about the history of policing, but I want to focus kind of on the now. So, and specifically abolition. So I guess there's a couple, I think in my mind, there's basically kind of two different questions that I think are kind of important and tend to be brought up a lot. First is it possible to abolish the police while maintaining the capitalist order? And I guess as kind of a thread off that, is the abolition of police seen as a way of abolishing capitalism in general? Because I know as socialists, as leftists, activists tend to get the brunt of police violence. Well, not get the brunt, but anytime you start to have revolutionary or any kind of mass uprisings, whether it be protests like in Standing Rock or the current ones, police are always there to put them down. So I'll start with that question.
Yeah, that's just a little question you got going on there. Just a little question about wow, I don't know. I mean, I think that like a good academic, and you got Luis the academic today, I try to report different kinds of arguments, right? And I think that first of all, there's no full agreement on this. So I think that there's debates about this, whether it makes sense to focus on police and as the location, or whether it makes sense to focus somewhere else, right? I mean, traditionally you can talk about individuals that are arguing about saying, no, you're never going to get there. It's got to be labor, engage with labor. Is the withdrawal of labor and the product, so you have all those kinds of arguments, and those people would disagree that police, that it makes sense for police. Here in the Southwest, maybe more now everywhere. It's a little, I think it might have started in these regions, but it kind of went everywhere, is the notion that maybe this conception of, decolonizing or anti-colonial kind of conceptions that what we have is settlements, right? Settler colonialism in relation to that. So from that particular argument, it would be like, no, it's actually land. You need to engage in land and how land is being used, both in relation to how land is accumulated, how it's sold, how it becomes commodified, how it's taken from people, how it's given to people. So therefore, your struggle should be in relation to land, right? And in some people, let's say, in those relations should be in relation to indigenous land, indigenous rights, and others would say, it might be also in relation to capital and trying to make sure that some land becomes public or some land becomes collective or communal and all those things. So to answer your question, I can't possibly answer other than to say it depends on what position you take and how you read where the struggle is. So I can give you the best possible argument, and to say, in the best possible argument from the position of police as an abolitionist issue, the best possible argument could be that if you look at the major uprisings over the last few decades, that should give you a hint of where the struggles of working class people and people of color might be. And it's really, really hard not to see what just happened in the US and then the first BLM mobilization as an indicator of some serious locations for struggle, right? That there is something showing there. Now, strategically, whether that's the right place or not, I don't know. It depends on your analysis. How's that for an academic answer?
Well, I actually always love when people problematize things like that, because I think it opens up a bunch of avenues for questioning and for analysis. So I guess now the second big question is, and Tyler kind of talked on this, and will there be some kind of entity that acts in a similar role as the police, as kind of enforcers of the law, or some kind of that has a monopoly on force? Or is the general idea that we move away from that kind of notion? And if so, maybe like, how do we do that? Again, another not easy question.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's just, these are really tough questions, right? And I think they're real important important questions. One of the questions is, I mean, there's several answers. One might be that, what I consider to be the Alain Badiou answer. Alain Badiou is this French theorist, and his notion of the answer of relation to change. He often says, in the middle of what he calls an event, which are like really serious moments of transformation. We can call them revolution, but you can call them events, meaning that where the reality looks like this, and then 3 months later, it looks like that, right? Almost unrecognizable, particularly quickly. That in these particular moments of that kind of transformation, that it's very difficult to make sense of reality and to understand what it is or how it functions. So one answer that is not very satisfactory for us as humans, I think, is to say can't tell. We can't tell what that's going to look like because there is no panacea here. There is no magic potion that is going to take us out into some wonderful utopian world. That's what I personally believe, that there isn't any. It's all going to be a struggle, and it's going to be dialectical in nature. It's my feeling. So that means that as soon as we create, and maybe this is Hegelian in me, is that as soon as we create a position and it creates its conflict, there's going to be conflict and something comes up, there's going to be this other location. There's going to be something else we left out. And my guess is that that's the nature of reality. Wow, I can't believe I'm telling you the nature of reality. But it feels to me like that's the nature of social reality, at least. That whatever we create, there's always something else left open. So as we struggle for this, we're struggling for this thing, right? In other words, you can think of it this way. Think about the civil rights struggle in relation to segregation, and then trying to engage segregation and eliminate segregation as a system. And there's no way to predict what came next, which was this open system of where race reproduced itself, but outside of the law, right? So that it recreated itself in particular kinds of ways. That's my guess, is that we have to engage in this particular struggle and make the moves that we're going to make, and that in those moves there will be other struggles that will come out. That's the best answer that I can give you.
Cole, any questions?
Yep. Yes. Do you know, at least within the framework of the abolitionist argument, I know there's been a lot of conversation, like kind of positive towards abolition, but I think one of the big questions that comes up is, how does an abolitionist framework address violent crime if there aren't police? Is there like a different kind of smaller specialized armed unit that's maintained, or what does that look like in an abolitionist context?
Sure. I think that's a loaded question because crime and violence are loaded terms. So when we use those, we tend to think like, oh, violent crime, we know what that means. The FBI for crimes, assaulted, or we think, but it's actually super loaded. It's already a question. Violence is already should be raise questions because we tend to think of violence equated with property, right? This comes out of John Locke, relationship to the idea that when we are as human beings, we create things, and as we create things, we create objects, and that those objects or those things that we create are extensions of our own being, and therefore the law developed in such a way that the destruction of that is it's a violation to the self because the property is an extension of the property is an extension of the self, right? So to say violence is like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean the interpersonal violence? Do you mean the violence of forcing entire bodies of workers to enter the education system? Do we mean the violence of ignoring or undoing safety standards for labor that has led to harm for huge amounts of people for entire generations? So that when we talk about violence, it's already loaded, and we have to be careful because we're already speaking a particular kind of language of the current social order. So therefore, and by the way, that's just it, violence. Crime's the same thing, right? In terms of what crime is in relation to how it's defined, how it's built and created and maintained and defined in the legal codes, has a long history in relation to certain kinds of relations that do that. So therefore, crime both changes over time in relation to what we think is crime and in relation of what it is. In some of the criminologists, the critical criminologists that I work with, they tend to move away from that and talk about harm. So notice that if we change the question to how do we deal with violent crime, and which already invokes a certain amount of safety and security, which then invokes the state, all that kind of language. If you say, how do we reduce harm? It changes entirely. Right? Because harm is really what we care about, not crime, but the harm that occurs. So that means that we move it away from the legal definition and we begin to talk about harm in relation to all kinds of harms that is occurring. And then we begin to open practices that reduce that. Now there's lots of people doing work on, restorative justice in relation to when you have particular kinds of harm, what you do is you restore, right? My friend, Emily Garter in University of Minnesota, Duluth, has been doing a lot of work in relation to healing circles. And it means these are groups of people that come together and the courts send people to them and they then engage with a long-term process with those particular kind of individuals to make sure that the harm that they produce, either in domestic violence or in theft or whatever it is then repaired and then engage in such a way that the individual is incorporated back into a particular community. So how we think of harm and how we think of that has a big impact. So how we deal with that, if we tend to think of that, we then opens up a whole variety of different social practices that are already engaged in a variety of other countries. So we don't even have to invent them, right? We're in a very specific kind of country that is mostly heterogeneous, and it's got all sorts of different issues, so we have to deal with that, but that there are practices in relation to the reduction of harm that are already present. That's my answer.
I think your response leads perfectly into a question, both your response of like, what are we talking about exactly when we talk about violence and harm, and also how messy of a process this will be and how there's no kind of magical silver bullet. I think many people are now understanding that when we talk about defunding the police, like you said, it has to go hand in hand with reinvesting in the communities and social services that have been kind of left by the wayside, in a lot of neoliberalism. But there are many people that are starting to raise the point that the institutions that we should be reinvesting in don't always necessarily reflect or help those who they are supposed to reflect and help. And so when we're speaking about defunding, and kind of adding on an additional layer of complexity into all of this, how can we go about ensuring that these institutions are doing what they're supposed to, and we're not just, I don't want to say mindlessly, but just like taking money and moving it over here and saying, okay, problem's done, we're okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a very serious question. I think that one of the problems that you have with policing and some of the critiques about reform is it's been around for a long time, is the notion of net whitening, that a lot of the times when reform comes in and the police say, well, you need to reform because of these particular issues, they go, okay, and they expand, they go, okay, we're going to include this, for example, maybe it's not the police, but in terms of the prison system, we're going to do parole and then we're going to do probation, we're going to do parole. So that way people don't end up in prison. And then what ends up happening is that the parole system, then the prisons stay the same or grow. And then now you have a side system that is actually capturing even more people. So now you have a system that has now, is bigger by, a third. That and it was a good attempt at trying to reduce it. So that I agree. The question is, how does that engage in relation to law enforcement so that that doesn't occur? One thing that was pointing out to me by a friend said, hey, he said he was talking to another friend that was doing work in China. And he said, it's interesting because this defund issue might have a problem because the police in China decided to defund the police in a particular way and began to decrease the number of officers in the street. But what they did is they began to invest in highly surveillance-based technology, face recognition, movement, all sorts of things that allow them to control or maintain the social order, just not through the police themselves. So that's the part when we have to think of these as systems, right? Not as the police officer. So the police is that these are system engaged in particular ways. And I think you're right that if we do this and we engage it and we expand it, we could end up actually doubling the function of surveillance rather than decreasing it. Given that, so I think we have to keep that in mind and we have to be very thoughtful of that. Given that, one of the things that I do know, I spent some time in Spain last year. And, this is a country that has some fascist history that's real and that, comes out of real fascism. But I noticed that the police seem to function a lot. There's fewer police and there's the social control aspect there is much, much lower. There's fewer number of them, and that their systems and their social welfare is actually quite strong. So that they people don't have to have an issue in relation to health. They have socialized health system. Education, they don't have to pay for education. It's paid for, completely. Higher education, universities and lower education, or primary education. That they have these systems that are set up in terms of labor and protection that go way beyond anything that we have. And I think that it's not a coincidence. In other words, I don't think that it's a coincidence that those systems that take care of the basic needs of human beings tends to reduce all sorts of other problems that engage in particular kinds of ways. I would not be surprised if crime doesn't go up in the United States because the unemployment money that was given was sometimes better than the work that people were engaged in before the unemployment. So that there might be a reduction because the need is going to be reduced for a second in relation to what actually often drives, not entirely, right? I'm not a Pollyanna. I don't think that there's no bad people in the world or no psychotic or no, I'm not saying any of that, but a lot of the things that engage in particular kinds of crimes tend to be desperation and engagement and just making a living in the world. And you reduce those particular kinds of needs and you're going to reduce the need for that. So I forget your question right now, but I'm sure it's related. I think I answered it in related, I hope.
I think that's actually kind of interesting because I know in other countries, since, you kind of brought up, I was reading an article recently, I think it was in Japan, where they talked about how like they were thinking about decreasing their police force because they had nothing to do. And I wonder, I mean, Japan has a good social safety net. Too, you know, and kind of bringing this back to maybe a historical question, I was shocked when I found out that sometime, I think it was in the 60s, prison abolition in the United States was actually a fairly popular notion, because prison populations, I think it was like a couple 100,000, and then the drug war popped up, and all of a sudden we see the ballooning of the prison population. And was there a correlation with an increase in police forces along those times, that period as well, to meet that?
Yes, there's two things that occur in terms of that, because I stopped really early, right? There's a lot more police history that occurs, but there's a couple of things that occur from the 60s onward. One of them is that the urban unrest that develops from, like, I forget, 66 to, 69, 70. There's lots of riots, like, kind of like what we just saw, but imagine that for several years, like every summer, engage in prolonged, that during that, the police had reformed themselves. And you begin to see at that point kind of a decline of, by the early 70s, a decline of the Vietnam War, and lots of equipment that was being used and developed for the Vietnam War that was going to be thrown away. They didn't know quite what to do. And they began to incorporate that into the police, and in the idea that there might be insurrections that they need to be put down, and the police were not really prepared for these insurrections, because the rhetoric of revolution was actually quite so high that people thought there was a revolution coming in particular. So the police responded, and they began to militarize, right? It was at that particular point that they began to incorporate military equipment in the early 70s to mid 70s, from those riots to incorporating that particular thing. Then you begin to see by 73 a global economic reorganization of the global economy that changes everything entirely, right? The beginning of neoliberalism, the beginning of an entirely different logic, the ending of the different kind of economy that started after World War II. And you begin to see poverty increase, and you begin to see problem issues. You begin to see the gas shortage and all of that, which leads to all sorts of uncertainty in the community. And you begin to see crime increase quite strongly based on the economic situation that occurs. So you begin to see an increase in militarization, and then you begin to see an increase in the budgets of policing in relation to these crimes that begin to increase because of the economic instability. By the 80s, you have not quite an increase, but it kind of starts to stabilize. The crimes begin to stabilize, and you begin to see police almost need to link somewhere else. And all of a sudden, the drug panic kicks in. And that is, all of a sudden, it's like the welfare queen world, that horribly racist welfare queen situation, the drug crime, what do they call the predatory criminals and crack babies, all that horrible language, right, that develops there in the 80s fuels this panic around drugs. And then all of that thing that I just described turns its attention towards drugs. And then you have, the idea of the war on drugs, and you have an increase in militarization, an increase in police officers that was based on the crime wave that was going on before, having to look at something else to do, and you begin to see the police drastically change in function and location. And that's really when you see the beginning of the incarceration period. You see that, and I should say that this is not all coming from Reagan or from the left and right. I'm not talking Democrats and Republicans. This was implemented with both, right? This was both Democrats and Republicans engaged in some of this behavior. And like Clinton was, put, I forget, 100,000 new police officers. I mean, that was his campaign. He ran on the idea that, we put 100,000 new police officers, in the streets for security, and he won on some of those. So you begin to see that, and you begin to also, you should know that it was liberal ideas that led to the three-strike law, which also then changed the laws in such a way that allowed for the incarceration of people at a much an increased speed. So 3 felonies, you go to prison, right? That came out of the idea that you should restrict the bias of a judge, because the judges were incarcerating Black people at a higher rate than white people. So people were saying, let's restrict that, let's create these laws. So it came from a reformation of the system that actually led to an increase number of Black people and Latino people in prisons. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting when we talk about the failures of reform. And last week we had Tyler Wall on, and he described the police almost as this extension of the executive branch, as something that's always going to be kind of outside of the jurisdiction of the law, which I thought was a fascinating kind of view. And I wonder, is the failure of reforms, in your opinion, and again, this is going to be another large question, is it because it doesn't view the police as this institution that is there to protect the social order, or is it because that ultimately our discourse doesn't connect crime or with social well-being? So that when you talk about harm versus crime, the idea is that there's just bad people. In the chat someone said the enemy, and I think that that can kind of connect. There's just bad people and we just got to deal with them, as opposed to people are products of social environments, and if you don't change the social environment, you're not going to change how things get how policing happens in society.
Yeah, so for me, if you're asking me, Luis, and I don't know if it is uncertain to me that if we eliminate police, we change the social order. I don't know if that's correct. It's the argument that's being made, and it's an argument that I find intriguing, and I'm following in relation to people making it and their struggles are occurring. I don't know if that's true, or if that's fully true or not. I don't know. I can't think right now of a single society that functions without some form of type of police, and that the police that enforce a particular type of social order, and that the question is how that social, what the social order is, and the function of police is to maintain one. So imagine a social order that protects particular kinds of rights, that protects people of color, that protects women, that protects transgender people, that protects the most vulnerable, right? And you have a system of officers that would be engaged in that, or engage in that particular kind of behavior. So that's not to say that I don't know. It's something that I struggle with in my own personal thinking, right? If the question is, what's the most social order that we can create, and how do we get there? Do we do it by the elimination of police? Do we do it by, and to be honest with you, the older that I get, the more worried I am that there is no such thing. And I don't want to, this sounds really negative for people, but during these last set of events that occurred, I was just kind of watching them and going, yeah, this is intense, but having studied these, I know they're going to die off relatively quickly. And I know, based on what I understand of social movements, I can almost predict the pattern because it's been studied over the last, 100 years, a little less maybe. But I can tell you what's going to occur. Then they're going to go this way. There's going to be a moment of opening, and then this moment will have a close, or there'll be a backlash. So there's going to be we're going to experience a backlash. And to be honest with you, as I speak to you, I'm a little hesitant in relation of what people are going, when the backlash comes and they find this video, the kinds of things that they're going to do, and they're going to engage in us, in relation to, threatening calls and all those kinds of things that I've already experienced in the past. Sorry, this is a way of saying that I don't know. It's a little unclear, both which theoretical understanding is going to allow us to have a clarity in relation to what to do in order to create a more just world seems really opaque to me right now. And I'm sorry, this is a little dark, and I don't mean to dissuade people. I just mean this is what I as an intellectual see right now. It is unclear which direction any of this is going, whether it's good or bad, or whether there's even a way out. It seems quite dark to me.
Well, as my chapter's pessimist, I can understand. Let me ask, because I think this is something that I was thinking of when you're talking about the initial history, and I think you just touched upon it. How was the social order maintained before the advent of like the formalized police system, like before the watchmen, before the slave patrols? And then I have a question about the slave patrols to build off that.
So a couple of things. That's a good, man, you're just asking me super tough questions,
Yes.
which I love it. I love it. And if I don't have answers, because I should have thoughts about these. A couple of things. One of them is, I think it's important that we tend to think about police. We tend to think that we can exist outside of policing, but I never think of that, because it always feels to me, think of different populations are going to have different answers to this, but think of how relatively little interaction you have with police officers in relation to the social order. And that is that we have informal sets of maintaining social order, for good and bad, by the way. That can be a bad social order or a good social order, but we tend to interact as human beings on a regular basis. We are generally not going to kill each other on a relatively regular basis. Now, does it happen? Of course it does. Are some people psychotic? And some people, of course they are. But on a regular basis, all over the world that I've traveled, I was just in Egypt not too long ago. I traveled to, I was in Jerusalem. I traveled through Turkey. And a lot of the time, I feel relatively safe as a human. That doesn't mean that there's no dangers or that there's no way to get hurt. Of course there are. But human beings are human beings, and we generally don't hurt each other that way. So that means that we're already engaged in non-policing action every day, almost entirely. We're almost there. The question is those moments when we engage in very serious moments and what to do about those particular kinds of moments. And we should really keep that in mind, right? That for a long time, human beings engage in relation to social control through informal means. We are very good at, unfortunately, we're very good at shaming. We are very good at making people feel like crap. We're very good at rewarding people, but we tend to shun people or tell them that they're dumb or that they're whatever it is, which is a form of control, which again can be good or bad in relation to that. We do that already. And I want to say that it's probably, 90% of human interaction. I'm just making that up. I don't know, but a majority of it. So we're talking about a small portion of it. A very serious but small portion of it. So, okay, so to answer your question is, we don't have to go back to hunter-gatherers in relation to functioning without police. It's happening now. And then if you then go to other countries, you'll see that it happens even less, that there's fewer police officers, and those interactions occur in those particular ways, and the social order is maintained through eye contact, through, whoa, what are you doing? Through all sorts of different things. One of the things is, just to give you an example, I was in a bus, in a train in Spain, and I was sitting there, and I've been over there about 3 months, and I was visiting, a friend was visiting, and this person came directly up to me and asked me for money in a really, what by that point I considered really aggressive. And it wasn't very aggressive for American standards. It was just somebody going, hey, do you have any money for, and I was like, whoa, what's happening? It's like, I'm in Spain. You do not do that in Spain. You do not confront people like this, And I'm looking at my friend, and she's looking at me like, what? The guy's just asking for money. And then as soon as I did that, there was an officer in the thing that came up to him and said, hey, what are you doing? And when he saw that, he just froze. And then everybody just looked at him like weird. And then he left the location. But that's to say that there's already certain kinds of practices that we see as normal that in other societies are not normal. And we can unnorm those. We can change those kinds of behaviors as human beings to make certain kinds of control. Again, I'm not saying that was a good interaction or not. It was just something that stuck to me like, whoa, that doesn't happen in this, and it doesn't necessarily require the police, because everybody around me could feel like something was wrong and would have come up, in my protection. Same thing happened to me in an airport, and Saudi Arabia, where I was, it's a long story, but I was actually held by the Saudi Arabia police. And the Spaniards, as I was traveling, the Spaniards came to my rescue and actually kind of got in between me and this police officer. And at the moment I was thinking, I'm going to be in a South Arabian jail for a long time. And they disrupted it and protected me in a way that, so humans, we do this. We generally protect each other in that. So back to the question. In relation to that, the question is not necessarily policing. The question is how we maintain particular kind of social orders. And those have been done in a variety of ways. It can be done through kinship. It can be done through religious practices. It can be done through encoding of laws that are civil laws. There's a variety of different ways. And this is not to say that that's all hunky-dory and perfect, because if you examine some of the societies, some of them are really violent societies. Like, I was reading a book in relation to the forest people that are engaged in forest, live in forest, and these are really, really tight clans, super tight tribal people. And then, so internally it's pretty good, but across another tribe, it can be really intense, that those fights can be particularly intense. So I don't know how to say it other than like what I said earlier. We're going to have particular kinds of issue regardless of what system we have in those. And what we got to do is just struggle with the one that's in front of us. The one that's in front of us, don't take your eye off of it, is the fact that young Black people, Latino and indigenous men, are getting shot and killed just by walking or by driving. And that's the one we're in the moment, and we're going to have to struggle through that one.
So kind of going to the South, and again, another history question. And I think this engages with the militarization of the police. What role has the military, or, well, let's start with like militias. What were the roles between the slave patrols and the militias? And you've touched on military and the police, but how did those relationships kind of continue throughout history? At least in the U.S.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. It's just, there's just so many changes, and historically so many different periods of history that I don't know which one to engage in. I think that, I guess I'll just answer it this way. This one. I think the Klan is one of the examples of what you just said, and that is an informal vigilante group that was really enforcing the racial order. Right, that was connected to law enforcement pretty strongly, but it was supposed to be kind of a club, right, that people engage in, and they engage in these particular kinds of practices. And it's important to notice that there is the formal aspect. There's law, so what's constituted in the law. Then there's what the police interpretation and application of those particular things, and then there's informal practices. In the South, in relation to the maintenance of segregation of the racial order in the South, it was done across all three of those, right? It was done through the law, through the police, and through informal relations. So, of course, there we have the history of lynching, right, which is absolutely stunning. And that is that between 1865 and 1965, roughly around that time, and not specifically spaced this way because it clumped in particular kinds of ways, but there was a murder, there was a lynching of a young Black man once a week for that entire century. That is, once a week for that entire century, a young Black man was lynched somewhere in the South in that. Again, that's the average. There's different periods where it's much more intense than others. And those were mostly informal, right? Those were not police lynching, or they might have been, looking the other way, but those were almost a dark carnivalesque relationship, which is a young Black man comes into town or is in town, and they do whatever, usually to a young white woman or a white woman or some other thing. Some other guys get together, they go to their house or do whatever, and they grab them and then lynch them, and they pull out a call. Often there was a call. People would come out for this like a carnival. There are unfortunately really, really horribly dark postcards that they used to create. So whenever somebody was lynched, they would take a picture, and you could then buy the picture and send it out. W.E.B. Du Bois writes about one particular lynching where an individual is burned and charred, and then they begin to sell the charred pieces of the individual's body as a souvenir of the lynching. So this is to say how incredibly dark this was, and it was mostly done outside of the police, right? But these were social relations. So this is where things become complicated, and that is that social interactions are not necessarily just purely okay. We just happen to have a social system that did this to Black young men, not only men, families, entire families, and women and children, and police that would either ignore them, right? Oftentimes the police would engage, arrest them, take them to a particular location, and then a mob would show up, bring him out of jail, and then lynch them right there on the spot with impunity. So it wasn't until in the early 1960s, I believe, maybe late 50s, when we have the very first trial of a person for lynching. So from 65 to, I forget, I think it's 54 maybe, there's nobody, 0 people convicted of a lynching. So to your question in relation to militias, you can have militias, and that's kind of interesting and everything, but look at the social order. Some of that was clan-based, some of it was just the people in that town and the relation and the power that they thought they had over the Black body.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about George Zimmerman earlier this week, and those kind of things always kind of made me concerned because, now we have the neighborhood watch, and I always worry that, some of the violence, I mean, I guess it, as you pointed out, it never was just the police, but it's built into the social order. And so I always wonder, like, when we try to take, sometimes I hear people talk about having like more civilian-esque, not really militias, but civilian kind of groupings replace police forces. And I always worry about those situations where you basically have like community watches that end up basically still enforcing these social orders, but now they're even almost less accountable because there's no real institution to hold them to account. It's just individuals who aren't even necessarily trained. They get to like act. And so because I always think of like almost the Scarlet Letter. It's like you have like these groupings of communities that enforce, and kind of like you were saying, that can be super violent even without police.
Yeah, it all depends. I mean, there are historical examples. We can do. Christian Williams writes about this, particularly in the last chapter of My Enemies in Blue. By the way, I asked him if he would come with this, and he said, "No, I'm terrible on Zoom, so unfortunately I couldn't." I was trying to get him to come. But if he writes about this, and he says, I was talking to him, and he's saying, look at the way that the Irish Republican Army engaged in this. And he says, and if you look at that, you will see that the Irish Republican Army was in a certain way kind of disastrous, right? They got in such a place that they moved the police outside of particular parts of Ireland. They couldn't come in because if they came in, they would just be riots if they came into that particular neighborhood. But then they had drug issues and they had crime issues. And then what the IRA did is they would come in and they would solve it by just shooting people in the knee. That was the solution, right? Somebody came and said, hey, this person's doing drugs. They would come over there and just be like, boom, shoot him in the knee. And then after a while, it was like, okay, now it became repressive. And the people were like, wait a minute, now we're a little bit afraid of the IRA, but they were supposed to be on our side. So it became this kind of issue that had to be undone in the 1990s with certain kinds of efforts that, to get them to stop shooting people in those ways. But he said, but if you look at the one in South Africa, is it the NRA? No, I'm thinking the RNC. In South Africa, says if you look at them, they were different because in their ghettos, the police wouldn't go because purely out of ignoring the ghetto. So they wouldn't come in there. They would do no policing, no services, nothing, right? It was just like this encampment almost that they had them in, and they, Black people in South Africa. So they developed a series of their own procedures. So they developed their own courts and their own systems of judgment. Christian says it's actually quite more functional. So they were able to actually function more like a system, a self-regulating system within a state that's not related to a particular state, so that when the apartheid fell, they had systems in place that actually were able to grow beyond the ghetto. So these are complicated questions with, yeah.
So I have, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have one last question to kind of end on that takes, I think, one of the core arguments you've made and try to turn it to the future. So one of the things that one of the primary arguments you were making was that the police are an institution, at least one of whom's primary functions is to uphold the social order, right? And so you also said that if we were to simply abolish police, that doesn't necessarily follow that those social orders will change and we'll all of a sudden be in a utopia and everything will be fine. And so I think the social orders that we're experiencing today stem from like many different places, including the police, including culture, including media, education. I mean, you could look at a whole host of different institutions in society. And so there's some who ask, are there other institutions that we should also be calling for the abolition of, or is it going to need very significant and transformative reform? Or I guess the general question is, moving forward, what does this kind of like and I know you don't have all of the answers for this, but what does this multi-pronged approach look like of analyzing all of the different institutions in our society that could be contributing to this social order and its many problems, and trying to make them better, I guess?
Yeah, I should be able to answer that in 3 words. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, man, this is the kind of thing that I've been thinking about for a really long time, right? And I think if I hear the question correctly, the question is, where's the location to struggle for the change of the social order, but particularly an unjust social order, right? Where is it? Is it the police? Right, and I think some people would argue that maybe that is the best location. So I don't want to put that aside. There's some people are arguing this is the location, and then for me it's always like, yeah, good, but I need to understand fully and to explain what's the jump between no police to because where it is from there to the unjust, because it eliminates a whole bunch of different things, but it might create other problems, and I don't know. If you're a Marxist, you might argue and say, no, it's always in relation to production. It's going to be in relation to how things are produced and how things are created. And therefore, until you transform the ownership of all that rhetoric, right? Until you transform that, you're not going to get that. You're only creating cosmetic change. From another perspective, you might say, it's the racial order. And you have to change the racial order, and that has to change entirely. From another position, so I'm just going to give you positions. Another position, this is one that I've been kind of reading about and been intrigued about, is the Black pessimist position, and that is the idea that there is no changing this system, that the system was created fundamentally from the start with an anti-Blackness to it, that cannot separate itself from every single concept that we have. I am not exaggerating. That's the argument. So the argument is not until we reinvent everything from what the essence of what it means to be human can we possibly engage in any kind of liberatory or freedom based. And the argument is, I'm not sure. And the argument from this position is from Wilderson, saying, I'm not even sure we can get there, or if there is a location, and it's not my job to tell you what that is. I'm just telling you that it won't eliminate the police, great. It'll be reinvented in some other particular kind of way. Again, I'm not arguing for these, but it depends on how you read those particular things. And I think that it's important to understand that nobody knows this answer, right? I can give you a liberal answer. And the liberal answer is, this is the best system, man. It's like the worst thing that can happen is we reinvent, Stalin, You know what I mean? We talk ourselves into thinking that some guy or some woman or something is going to end up giving us the liberatory brotherhood or sisterhood or human, whatever it is, and then we end up killing 10 million people in the process of cleaning our souls, you know? I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just giving you different kinds of thoughts in relation to this. I have arrived at a much less sure. I am less sure of myself at 51 than I was at 25 and 30. Much, much less sure. I was almost convinced I knew exactly where the problem was and where to engage it and how to engage it and how to do that. And I don't know if that's just like middle age and you shouldn't listen to me and you should engage as a 25 and a 30-year-old and forget what Luis is saying. That might be the reality of the situation because I did not trust 50-year-olds when I was younger. So, or that, I don't know, that this is complicated. So again, I can't answer your question. All I can say is it's looking like every single one of these are going to be tested in the coming years. So we might get to see some answers, some possible attempts at answers at some of these. And as a person that reads about history and it doesn't. There's nothing in history that suggests that it's going to be good necessarily, and we're living it, and we're going to see it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Luis, for being here and speaking tonight / this afternoon in Arizona. I know you have Policing Dissent out there. You also have Shutting Down the Streets. Do you have any other books or something you're working on that you'd like to plug that you think people should know about?
There's an article that I posted in relation to the abolitionist stuff. If you really want to read about a little bit more in depth, because I kind of talked about it, but not quite as in depth as that. I just put it on there. And it's an article titled Disband, Disarm, and Disband, Disempower, and Disarm, Amplifying the Theory of Practice of Policing with Megan McDowell. It's free there, and you can read all about it. It's a little academically, I've been told, sorry. That was intention, but this was written a couple of years ago. But it really goes into a lot of the notions of particularly abolitionist abolitionist theory, quite in much more depth. And it can just tell you some of the history, some of the arguments, even differences in abolitionist perspective. And then it just kind of chronicles before this wave, some of the claims that people were making around the police that I thought at that time were relatively new, and now they're commonsensical.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And thank you, again for speaking tonight. As someone that studied philosophy, it sounded almost very Socratic in the fact that it was just problematizing things, showing that there's a lot more depth. And I think that that's important. And I think that that's helpful as opposed to trying to provide answers. Because sometimes especially in the beginning, it's just asking questions, having the questions to ask is what allows people to really think deeply about these topics. So I appreciate that.
I'm a deep Democrat with a small d, not the capital D, deep. And I believe that understanding only occurs through dialogue, only occurs through debate, and it definitely has to occur to understanding that you're wrong. Many years ago, people told me it's going to be around the police, there's going to be movements around police killings. And at the time I was like, no way, it's immigration, man. It's only immigration. Immigration's and then I learned to be humble and go, oh, guess what? I was so wrong about that. So with all these, you get a little older, you realize like, okay, you can understand some things, you can predict some things, and much of it is beyond my grasp because it's complicated.
Well, we appreciate it so much. Thank you. Thank you everyone that attended. Next week, we have our next speaker series. Cole, did you go over that? Sorry.
Yes. So next week, we have Caitlin Bailey, who is the Director of Communications for the national nonprofit organization Decriminalize Sex Work. She is a former sex worker, a stand-up comedian, and Director of Communications for said organization. And she'll be talking about what the police's relationship is to prostitution and sex work, and how that reflects the larger issue that is in the zeitgeist at the moment. So thank you so much for being here, Luis. Thank you all for coming and watching, and I hope you learned something valuable and enjoy your night.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.